Thank you, Jay, and thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about, as you said, the essentials for funding success, how to write a successful application. Um, and I guess one of the first things I just want to say is that don't worry, most of your applications will not be successful. And you really just need to persevere to get funded. But what can we do to increase our chances of a successful application? So I want to talk about the things to do in advance. And I mean like way in advance, like 2 years in advance. To write a successful major grant really takes a lot of time. So please give yourself time. Oh, sorry. Time to formulate your ideas. I mean, you're going to formulate and reformulate and, rip up ideas and throw them in the trash and make new ideas and then get those old ones out of the trash. And it really just takes time to let these ideas mature. Know the literature. So you want to be an expert on the background literature underlying your topic of your grant. First of all, you want to know, what has been shown out there. And you want to know this backwards and forwards. And once you have a really solid understanding of the literature, then you can begin to begin to understand what's missing here. What are the controversies? What are the gaps in our knowledge? What do we think we know? But actually, if you really read the literature closely, we don't know. And why do we not know it? And you're only going to be able to gain that sort of mature understanding of the background literature if you give yourself time. You need time to generate preliminary data, obviously. That takes the most time of anything. You ideally want data to support every aim. Each individual aim should have some supporting data to support your hypothesis and also the feasibility of your studies. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Unfortunately, you do need to publish, and that takes time. Depending on what kind of grant you're trying to obtain, obviously you'll be expected to have more or less of background publications, but that it is an essential part so that you can convince the reviewers to believe not only in what you've written that you're trying to do, but also to believe in you as the right person to do this work. Read successful applications. So, like everything else, grant writing is sort of a game that you have to figure out the rules to. And so at first it seems really foreign. And, I remember when actually I was with Jay in Scott Worthen's lab, and I was a fellow, a postdoc, and my mentor, Scott, said to me, well, go home and think of some aims. And I'm like, well, what's an aim? So the way that we think about grants and we write grants, it's like every other culture that you might belong to. It has its own set of rules, and you're not going to really get that until you've read other good applications. Please write ahead of time to give yourself the opportunity to get feedback. And I mean solid feedback. And so, we're all overworked and stressed and we procrastinate, but when you give your grant to somebody to read, they are only able to help you in as much as you have time to make the changes that they suggest. And so I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see is, people ask me to read their grants like a week before the deadline. And it's like, well, I sort of want to give suggestion A, B, and C, but I know I can't because it would take more than a week to make those changes. And so if you give someone your grant to read at the last minute, you're only going to get really superficial feedback. And it's hard to finish it, a couple months in advance of the deadline. But it's really important, especially at the early levels. This is sort of just a grantsmanship trick a little bit, but reviewers do like to see that you have collaborators in the field, that you have, reached out to this person to give you this critical reagent that's going to be needed to do, AIM 2.1, or that this person can teach you this technique, or this, expert in the field is actually going to give you some conceptual advice on this grant. And this is really important for people in training, like training grants, postdoc level, and F32 and K level grants. Some of these letters can be, these collaborators can be people who are actually going to train you, which is in large part the purpose of those grants. Okay, so the sort of most critical points I want to make are be enthusiastic. If you're not enthusiastic that what you're doing is important, then why would anyone else be enthusiastic about it? And that's what you really need to impart to your reviewers. They're going to need to go to bat for you at study section, and they're going to need to believe that this is a really important subject that you're tackling, and you're going to do it in the right way so that they can advocate for you. Now, while you want to be really enthusiastic, don't tell them to be enthusiastic. And this is another mistake that I see. You want to let them develop their own enthusiasm. So, I mean, it's sort of a pet peeve, but I hate it when I read grants and the investigator is sort of saying over and over again that, this is really exciting data, or this is a groundbreaking study. I can decide for myself if I'm excited. You don't want to tell the reviewer to be excited, but you want to get them excited. Be specific. This is another thing that I see junior investigators erring in. So sometimes the hypotheses are a little bit too general, and the terms that are used are sort of vague. So keep asking yourself, what exactly do you mean by this hypothesis? What exactly do you think is going on? And when you throw out a term, well, what do you mean by that term? Which direction do you think it's going in? I can give some examples of this a little bit later. Know your audience. So if this is going to a study section where you really have experts in the field, you're going to write a certain way because you're going to assume that they have a certain baseline knowledge. However, if your grant is going to a more general study section, like a foundation study section, you may not have people exactly in your field, and you need to be able to quickly explain to them enough about your field that they can understand it and then get excited about it. But err on the side of being more general and aiming this to a sort of a more generalist audience. We could talk about this again later, but you don't want to lose people. Don't worry about spelling things out too much for experts. You want to sort of aim this at the lowest common denominator kind of thing. Do not overstate what you can prove. So if you, say what your hypothesis, say what you're going to do in your anticipated results, don't claim that you're going to be able to discover something that your studies really won't justify, that your data really isn't going to justify in the end. You really want to be conservative about that. And don't overstate the translational potential of your work. I mean, yes, we're all working to do something that somehow relates to human disease, but I'm sorry, most likely you're not going to cure a disease with one R01. So don't sort of pretend that you are. And along those lines, just acknowledge the limitations of your work. Okay, so I thought we would go, quickly through the critical sections of the grants. And I know that you guys have all have familiarity with this, so I'm not going to tell you, exactly what all the sections are for. You probably know that, but I was just thinking I would give some general thoughts and tips about how I look at each section. So the AIM section, and I think you're going to hear a little bit more about this in the next talk. You want to tell a story to your reviewers, a beginning and a middle and an end. That's how our brains are wired to think, and that's how you're going to get them excited about what you want to do. So you're going to start off with an introduction to the field, and then you're going to talk about why is this important, right? If it's not important, no one's going to give you money. That's what we mean by impact. What's the impact this is going to have? How is this going to change the field? And this might be that it's going to just not just, but it's going to provide more knowledge, or this could be something that's more translational and is going to lead to, novel therapeutics or a change in clinical outcomes. It doesn't matter if it's more basic and is just going to be a discovery grant, or if it's more translational, you still want to emphasize the importance or impact of what you're doing. So, okay, now you've convinced your reviewers that this is important. Now you want to talk about, well, what's known? What's already been established about this field? And this is leading them down the line of the scientific premise. You're going to tell them what is known and then what is not known. And this is so key. You want to establish early on what is the gap in our knowledge that you are going to fill, and it's an important gap, and you're going to fill it with this grant. And everything sort of feeds back into the specific gap in knowledge that you've defined. Your goal is to fill that gap in knowledge, and then the next step is your hypothesis. What do you think is the answer to that gap? Like I said before, you want your hypothesis to be very clear, use very specific terms, do not use vague terms, and think about exactly what you think is going on. It has to be a mechanistic hypothesis, and it has to be a hypothesis that is going to move the field forward, not something that's incremental. Like Jay said, the funding situation is too competitive right now to do just incremental science. You want to have a hypothesis that's really going to be novel and tell us something that we don't already know. Avoid using circular reasoning. You don't want to prove something. You don't want to state in your question what your hypothesis is. Okay, so aims. Like I said, I didn't really know what is an aim. To me, an aim is a sub-hypothesis. So you have your general hypothesis that you want to test. And then within that general hypothesis, you may have 2 to 4 more specific hypotheses. These need to be really specific and focused. I don't think it matters exactly how you phrase them. People will tell you different things, but you want to phrase them as something that's testable. So people will do like aim 1 to determine whether, blah, 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 or to test the hypothesis that blah, blah, blah. So you do want it to be something that is testable, and you want to put your money down. You don't want to just say, determine if, or determine how this works. You want to put your money down that you think it works like this, and you're going to determine if it works like this, or test the hypothesis that it works like this. People say that the aims should be independent of each other, and the idea there is that if one aim fails, you don't want the rest of the grant to fail. This can be hard, and it can be a little bit contrived to try to separate the aims because they are all under one hypothesis, but some reviewers will call you on that. And then the last thing is what your expected outcomes are, and then that loops back into your gap. So you've said why this is important, what's known, what's not known, what your hypothesis is, and what you think you're going to find, and what you think you're going to find is how that's going to fill that gap. Spend a lot of time in your aims page. All study section members will read the aims page, and all of them are going to vote on your grant. I love cartoons. As a reviewer, I'm constantly referring back to the cartoon on the aims page to figure out, okay, where in this overall hypothesis, does this aim 2.4 fall? And then I look and I see this little arrow, and sometimes people even put the aim number on these arrows, and like, oh, that's where we are in the overall structure right now. Okay, so the first section after the aims is the significance and rigor of the prior research. And this is where you're going to establish a scientific premise. And basically, you're going to flesh out what I was just talking about, where you talk about the background, why is this important? What's known in the field? What's not known? What's the gap? And then that leads you directly into your hypothesis. So you want this part to be focused and scholarly. This is not a comprehensive review article. You don't have room for that. And you'll lose the reviewers if you do try to do that. So you want to be very focused and really only talk about things that you're actually going to study. Don't go on tangents, about the whole field. It's okay to highlight your own contributions in this section. section. And you can do that by citing your papers or by providing your own preliminary data. People have different ideas of where to put preliminary data, and it may depend on the specific grant and the flow. What I like to do is in this section is where I'll put preliminary data that supports the hypothesis. Whereas preliminary data that supports more feasibility, I might put later on in the method section. You want to, I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but you don't want to just like review the literature like, you know, this study showed this and this study showed this, but you want to critically evaluate that literature. You know, this study showed this, and therefore, you know, it took us to this point, and here's the gap that here's where it left off, and here's the gap that we need to figure out now. Or this study, you know, claimed to show this, but if you really look at it closely, you actually see that the data didn't support that conclusion. So this might be, you want to be critical. This might be a place where you're actually going to question dogma and say, wait, we thought we knew this, but actually we don't know this. So let's, you know, let's study it this way. Like I said, get them to the gap and get them excited that there is an urgent need to fill this gap in our knowledge. Innovation is also a place that you're going to get reviewers excited, because you want to be doing something new. Obviously, they don't want to give you, you know, a couple $1 million to redo something that's already been done. But you know, it's just one grant, and so you want to be clear about how you're moving the field forward, but also be honest. And people talk about conceptual innovation, which means you're testing a new hypothesis and the new knowledge that this will bring us, or technical innovation, which means, you know, within the grant, you're going to be making a new mouse, which will then be available to the public. This is a little bit of a subjective section in the reviewers' minds, but if you do it right, it can really generate enthusiasm. So research strategy, this is obviously the meat of the grant, and you're going to have your aims, and within your aims, you're going to propose your experiments, essentially. The way most people structure each aim is, so you state the aim, and like I said, you want to, it has to be hypothesis based and specific. And then I review a little bit. Every time I state a new aim, I go back to the background section, and I sort of just reiterate briefly, why is this important? What is known, and what's the gap pertaining to the specific aim, rather than what the gap is for the whole grant. And then you can say, well, your hypothesis of how you're going to fill the grant is this. And then you describe your experiments. Now, the grants are short now. They're not 25 pages like they used to be. And so there really isn't very much room for detail, and you don't want the reviewers to get bogged down in that anyway. A lot of times you're going to say you're just going to use this kit according to manufacturer's instructions, or you're going to do this method the way you've done it previously in previous citations, or other people have done it. So you want enough detail so that they believe that you know how to do it, but not too much detail. It is really critical to identify the pitfalls in your proposed experiments, and every experiment has pitfalls. So, you know, to try to act like, you know, sometimes you'll read a person puts a pitfall section, but they'll just say, well, you know, there are no pitfalls. This is going to all work. And I mean, things never work exactly. There's always something that may go wrong. And by being honest about what that is, you know, shows a maturity in your thought process, and, you know, as a critical scientist, and make sure that the pitfalls are not just limited to purely technical issues. And that can be a common mistake. It's like, well, you know, this could go wrong because this antibody didn't work. Well, yes, that's true. But you want to talk about like a major pitfall, like, what if you're wrong? What if your hypothesis is completely wrong and you disprove it? Then what are you going to do? And then you can provide alternative approaches to both technical issues and, you know, more conceptual pitfalls. Okay, so for preliminary data, what I like to do in this section, just so I don't have all the preliminary data in the beginning, is here's where I insert preliminary data that supports the feasibility of the study rather than the hypothesis itself, because here's where I'm sort of explaining the methods. take them through, take the reviewers by the hand. Do not make them think. You want to explain exactly what your figures show, exactly what you're going to do and how that's going to answer your question. And, err on the sides of you on the side of using lay terms. I mean, you don't need every word to have 4 syllables in it or to be, a technical scientific term if you can just, describe this in English, because you want to make it easy for your reviewer to read this. Sometimes it's helpful to put in figures to illustrate what you think the results are going to show, or tables where you list the different experiments and the different outcomes. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Introduction, I saved this for last because this is obviously something that you only need for resubmissions. But it can be really critical for determining if you're going to get funded on a resubmission. And overall, I mean, not getting a grant beats you down. And like I said in the beginning, it's going to happen more often than it's not going to happen, that you don't get a grant. And so you will get used to it. And really to be able to have experts in the field spend their time, take time out of their day to read your ideas and give you feedback is really an honor and something that we should all be very grateful for. And I have to say 9 times out of 10, reviewers have helped me so much to make my ideas better. And I think that if you go into this introduction page with that attitude, it really shows. It's a 1-page introduction, so you don't have that much room. So I just quickly restate the major criticisms. You can't address everything, but the major criticism I just state as a clause, and then I address this. And, obviously we all want to be very nice to the reviewers, but, don't go over the top. And especially if you disagree with what they're saying, you may be right. So, if they say something that you really think is wrong, be firm about that and explain to them why, that criticism is appreciated, but you disagree with it, and give evidence for that. And a lot of times that carries a lot more weight than just, what's it called? Just a quick knee-jerk reaction to just say, okay, to whatever the reviewer recommends. You want to show that you've actually made progress, and that you've actually acted in response to their criticism. So based on this criticism, you did this experiment and generated this new preliminary data, and that'll go a long way. So it's a little bit weird. For resubmissions, don't expect that every reviewer will be the same. Probably at least 1 out of the 3 reviewers will be new, and they will not have seen the original application. They will see the summary statement, but they won't have seen the original application. So don't assume that they know what you said the first time and now how you're modifying that. Okay, so what happens? So submission. So however your institution works, you have to leave time enough to, if they call it routing, to route your grant through the institution so that your division and your department and your institutional level have approved this submission. And actually, they're the ones submitting the grant. You don't technically submit the grant, and you technically aren't funded. It's the institution that's funded. And so know the timeline for routing your grant at your institution. Okay, so what happens after you submit? Okay, I'm running up against the time. So it's assigned to an institute and then a study section. Reviewers are chosen based on their expertise, but not every reviewer is going to be an expert in exactly what you're doing. Those reviewers need to be advocates, because they're going to speak up for you in front of the whole study section and try to convince the study section why you should be funded. So get them on your side. After the study section meets, scores will be uploaded to ERA Commons very quickly, within a day or two. And then it will take more time, around on the order of a month, to get actually your summary statement, which is the actual criticisms. Then it will go to council, you'll get a just-in-time request, and you will be funded. Okay, so last slide. Overall, I hope that was helpful. My take-home tips are be enthusiastic and generate enthusiasm in your reviewers. what do we not know that your grant is going to help us know? And why is it important that we know that? And if you can do that, you'll get people excited and they'll want to go to bat for you. Cater your writing to your audience and always err on the side of taking reviewers by the hand, being very basic and explaining everything. You're not going to offend an expert by over explaining things, but you do risk losing people who aren't experts in the field. Be specific in your hypotheses and your terminology, explain everything. Like I said, plan ahead, get feedback, give people time to give you real constructive feedback. So like a month or two ahead of the deadline. Oh, this is one thing I didn't mention. They talk about not being overly ambitious, especially for career development grants, but in my bias is that you'd rather err on the side of being ambitious than be criticized for being too simplistic. Join study section. There actually is a request out for junior investigators to get involved in study sections. And I think seeing how things work on the other side can be really helpful. And like I said in the beginning, just persevere because most grants won't get funded. But if you keep submitting, eventually you will. So thank you for having me. Thanks for your attention.
Okay. Thanks again, Jay, for inviting me and putting together this symposium. It's been outstanding so far. And I also want to thank Rachel for an outstanding introduction. It's a great setup. And unfortunately, several of my comments are going to be somewhat redundant to what Rachel said, but nevertheless, a really great intro. So Jay asked me to talk about what reviewers are looking for. And, the first thing I like, because I give talks like this a fair amount, here and at other institutions. And I like to kind of, give a background of myself to have a little bit of credibility with the audience. How do I know what it's like to be an NIH reviewer? And so, one of the aspects of it is that I've actually done an extensive amount of service. So it turns out, just by counting these the other day, I've actually served on 60 individual panels over the last 15 years or so. And it's really every type of grant you could think of, whether it's an F grant or a U grant or K grant. I've pretty much reviewed them all. And so I've seen a lot of things. And the other thing is, as Rachel alluded to, is as an investigator, I've also been an extensive, grant submitter. I've, been awarded several R1s. I've gone through a couple of R21s. I've had just as many, if not more, grants not funded, so I know what it's like to be defeated on numerous occasions. And also as a, reviewer, as well as a grant submitter, we've gone through a lot of changes. Rachel, alluded to this earlier, grants used to be much longer. When I submitted my first, R01, we put 5 copies in a FedEx box and walked it down to the FedEx place. We didn't transmit it electronically. Scoring has changed. The critiques have changed. How many times you can go in has changed. And obviously, every few years, we have to start writing our grants in a different way. We have to change our sections and how they, are incorporated into the grant and things like that. So there's been a lot of changes. It's up to you to stay up on top of these things so you don't end up submitting applications that are, defective in a way that the reviewers are expecting to see, and you left out an important section that is scoreable or something like that. So this is, I tried to do this from a reviewer's perspective, and then as I put this together, I found myself actually talking as a grant submitter as well. So they're kind of, the vignettes are kind of intermingled. But, I think, as a reviewer, the best grants that I read are those that tell a story. And it's exactly what Rachel said, it has a beginning and a middle and an end, And I think the most important, section of a grant is the specific aims page. That is where I get hooked as a reviewer. That's where what Rachel said about enthusiasm, that's where my enthusiasm initially starts, and I consider the aims kind of like a movie trailer. I watch the trailer and I get excited about, actually going to the theater or downloading that movie or whatever. To me, that's the specific aims page, is that, it really gets my enthusiasm up, and it also gets my curiosity up about where are they going with this? What are they really, going to show me here? So I can't stress enough of how captivating that aims page, needs to be. I mean, it's essentially the entire grant on a single page. You're putting everything into that one page. And so you want to make sure that, it really, really pops. And the other thing is, I kind of like, try to write the grant as if you're talking to somebody, if you're actually having a conversation. It's almost like when you're at a poster session at ATS and somebody comes up and they're enthusiastic about your science, and you're enthusiastic about your science, and you guys just start kind of vibing, and you're just kind of going back and forth. That's, and it sounds hard to do, but and it's probably easier from a reviewer's perspective than it is somebody who's actually writing the grant. But, sometimes when I read grants, the really good ones, obviously the science has to be there, but, it's speaking to me. It's almost like the person is reading the grant to me. It's that clear. And I really, really like to read grants that are like that. I mean, they're really page turners, almost like a good novel. The other couple of things that I like to look at, and this is actually a saying that we have in the study section that I'm currently on, is always consider these two things about your proposal. Can it be done and should it be done? So can it be done is really, are the capabilities there? Not only do you have the expertise, do you have the right collaborators, do you have the right reagents, mouse strains, inhibitors, whatever you're working on, can you do everything that you either say you are going to do, or, can you do what is going to answer the question? Do you have the ability to do that? And then obviously, Rachel talked about this too, is that should it be done regarding, and this is really regarding the significance, why should we care? Who cares about, pneumonia? Who cares about asthma? Who cares about, pulmonary fibrosis? You need to really, really stress why your grant needs to be funded from the standpoint of learning something new. And this kind of goes to the next point on, finding the controversy, finding the gap in knowledge. I think Rachel put it best where, hey, this is a general thought or a fact in the field, but if you really dig into the literature, it's not as clear cut as you think it is. My most recent R1 was based on that fact, is that there was all this data out there that suggested, something was happening. And when you dug into it, it really was never proven that thing was really, really happening. And so, you really have to find those gaps and find those holes. Now, again, you need to be objective in this process, because you don't want to come off as being too biased or pre-drawn conclusions, because, invariably, when you have such a strong feeling about something, I have a reviewer that has a complete opposite feeling, and they're an expert in the field like you are. And so you never want to, you always want to say, look, this is what I think, but, there's another side of the coin, that is out there too. And we need to figure out, which one is correct, or which mechanism is the correct one to pursue. Rachel also talked about this: include preliminary data that evokes curiosity. I'm not a big believer in including 27 figures of preliminary data. I include preliminary data that shows feasibility, but also shows some level of excitement. Oftentimes this is stuff that is unexpected, or phenotype that is stronger than I anticipated, or things like that. There's a lot of times where, as a reviewer, I see this preliminary data and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. That's really, really interesting. But sometimes as a reviewer, you'll get a piece of data and it'll be like, wow, is that right? Is that really true? I'm not sure that's correct. And well, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. That's an unexpected way to go, but the data supports what they're saying. So maybe we need to to fund this, if you will, because the data is so provocative. So I think you want to always think about that of generating some excitement. The other thing I like to say is I like to talk about leveraging your publication history, and what that means to me is it's very comfortable to be able to cite your own work, in that you publish 3 or 4 papers on a certain pathway or a certain topic or whatever, and then you're able to kind of go back to those and say, hey, we've shown this, we've shown this, we've shown this. This leads us to ask the next set of questions. Every one of us writes papers in our discussion. We always talk about things we're going to do in the future. We always talk about things that are ongoing in the laboratory. We kind of refer to these as future directions and things like that. So I think when you're able to do this, you're kind of arguing from a position of strength. You have a baseline, you've got a publication record, you've got ideas that are constantly flowing, and you're demonstrating your ability to get those ideas out. And so I think having publication history, particularly in the grant that you're writing, in the area of the grant you're writing, I think gives you a lot of motivation and a lot of foundation to write those proposals. Here's some other aspects from a reviewer standpoint that I do find to be a little frustrating. Do not skimp on stylistic aspects. It kind of goes to the next point. Do not use excessive bolding, italics, underlining. It's very distracting. I'm the type of person that, if I see a font size change in a paragraph, I'll notice it immediately. If you go from Times New Roman to Arial in the same paragraph, I'll notice it. And for whatever reason, it bothers me. And so, because that's, to me, is a lack of attention to detail. And if that's how you write a grant or put together a grant, maybe that's also how you run your experiments or something like that. And so, sloppiness, is not something you ever want to come off as being in your grant application. So, you want to make sure that it's clean and concise and very, very clear, in grantsmanship as well as in scientific, terms. One thing I stress to everybody is always print out your grant. I mean, most reviewers that I know, they don't review the grants on their computer. They print them out and they read them, at the coffee table or the coffee shop or wherever. And so, if you print it out and you see that figures are missing or the error bars are gone or the asterisk for the significance is gone, you'll know that ahead of time. You don't want it to be surprising, when the reviewer prints out the grant and where's figure 7? Figure 7 got embedded under figure 5 and the reviewer can't find it. So you want to print out your grant to make sure that you can see everything and see what the reviewer is going to see. The other thing that we see a lot of times that even today happens is a lot of people don't have an accurately done biosketch. They leave off the MyNCBI link. They put things on there that's not relevant to the grant per se. Things like that. And so it gets kind of frustrating. You don't know if the person is really an expert or not. And you kind of have to do your own sleuthing and online, searching to figure out exactly who the person is. Those things are, it puts more work on the reviewer and we're not really interested in having to write the grant for you and try to figure out what you're trying to do. The other thing is, don't ask for more money than you need. When you write a grant and 75% of it's in vitro and you're asking for 2 postdocs, a tech, a student, and you've got 2 collaborators and you want $500,000, it's really insulting. Live within your means, and be, not frugal. If it's not a modular grant, it's not a modular grant, but be realistic about your ask. Don't do it just because you can. It needs to be justified. And then down at the bottom, don't cheat. Even to this day, you'll see, grants that it's very clear it's a 10.55. You'd be surprised how many times you do a grant and, you can tell the difference between 11 and 10.5. And it's not fair, to be brutally honest with you, because that means you're getting more in a grant than just about everybody else. When you see grants where the G's and the Y's are cut off because it's touching the next line of letters or the next sentence and everything, you could tell that somebody has been, playing with, margin and lines per square inch and things like that. And that just, to me screams honesty. And that it makes me not want to trust, the person, who's doing that. Some other, things about reviewers, and Rachel talked about this too. We love to use the word dense, where you have to read the grant twice to really understand what they're trying to do, where they're going with it. Overambitious is another word that we use all the time, although I agree with Rachel 100% that you want to err on that rather than being, lack of depth. Aims are dependent. We still see this a lot, mainly from junior investigators, but we still see a lot where, the aims, aim 3 cannot be done if aim 2 doesn't work, things like that. Other annoyances, typos, sometimes you'll use a lot of abbreviations that you don't spell out or not common. Figure legends, that don't really tell you what's happening. I get frustrated when somebody talks about, this is what's happening, and then they don't tell you the time. They don't, you don't know when you're looking at the data, and it could mean all the difference in the world because, you might be measuring something, at a time point that's really, maybe there's a lot of differences, but it's not really relevant in the time course of the whole model that you're looking at. So I think you need to have, very informative figure legends. Obviously, it goes without saying, don't make your figures too small. It doesn't happen as much anymore, but every once in a while you get that grant that you print out and you just can't see anything, and then you have to, put the PDF on 400% to see exactly what the figure is. Rachel touched on this about the certificates. It's not a state of the art review. You're not there to write 2 pages of background. You want to be very concise and talk exactly about the area that you're working in, but not being extensively wordy about it. 2, materially and methody. I kind of use that in a playful way, in the sense that you don't have to write every single experimental detail. We don't need spin times and how fast you're spinning, and things like that. We don't need all the detail that you would put in a paper. Some of this can be referenced, but you don't need to. You really don't have the length to do it. But a lot of times, especially with junior investigators, the aims get a little too materially and methody, and it takes away from actually trying to understand the science a little better. No letters from collaborators. I can't tell you how many times somebody talks about getting the gift of the knockout mouse. I kind of wonder sometimes is the person that's giving them that knockout, do they know they're giving it to them? Because there's not a letter included, So I think it's really critical that if you're going to be using other people's reagents and mice and things like that, you need to have a documented relationship with them and need to have those in letters that are included. The other thing is that, and I see this more than anything as a reviewer, is that I see a proposal that is very interesting, that has very strong preliminary data, and all the grant does is redo the preliminary data. Maybe they add one more time point, but they don't go into any mechanistic depth or anything like that. They just repeat everything in the preliminary data. And, that's just not, again, it's just, there's no depth there. I believe the preliminary data. You showed me the preliminary data. As far as I'm concerned, that's law, that's gospel. I believe everything. You don't have to repeat it, all throughout the grant. That's the primer. You need to go deep. And so that's something that we see constantly. And that's at every level. That's not just a junior person. That a lot of people still can do stuff like that. Regarding your ideas, again, details are very important, but so is organization. You might have this great idea, really impactful proposal, but it might not be enough. You have to get across, again, the significance of your work, why it needs to be done, so the reviewers can really understand what you're trying to do. The other thing that's a pet peeve of me as a reviewer is, don't cite references that are old. If you're talking about how bad pneumonia is, don't give me a reference from 2010. If flu, was really, really bad, give me something that happened, in the 2019 season. Tell me what happened, in relation to, current times. Because I think again, this kind of goes back to the lack of attention to detail. And I think it's important to be up to date on these things and have clearly, outlined bibliography and have the most relevant, references in there. Rachel alluded to this, and this is something I completely agree with, is that you don't need to jump too fast into writing your application. I spend months writing the abstract, the hypothesis, and the aims. Sometimes I'll write the abstract and the aims, and then I write the hypothesis, and then I rewrite the aims, and then I rewrite the hypothesis, and I go back and forth. And that literally takes months. I tweak it and I tweak it and I tweak it. The research strategy, the actual approach, takes me a week, maybe two. Once I get that specific aims page down in there, I can flow with the rest of the grant quite easily, because I'm constantly thinking about the data that I do have, and then the data that I want to get, right? So the data I do have is my preliminary data. The data that I want to get is the data that is the grant that I'm going to write, the aims that I'm going to write. So you just have to remember, that page needs to be really ironclad. Again, as Rachel said, your aims must always test your hypothesis. Also, don't test the waters. I hate it when, you get a grant and it's just somebody throwing something against the wall to see if it sticks or not. I don't really appreciate it. I feel like my time's a little wasted when a grant's put together and, it's just, it's sloppily put together. It's not very, current, it's not very bold. There people are just, and this happens a lot with R21s, I find, it mainly rather than R1s, is that people are just trying to get something to go. And so I would rather you put something that you put your heart and soul to, and you really want to try to get it funded rather than just roll the dice and try to get something funded. Don't make the reviewer look for stuff. So this is a little opposite of something I said earlier, but let me explain it. It's okay to reference previous observations or data or something that you published and everything, but you don't want to send the reviewer running around reading 5 of your last papers and everything. You want to be able to summarize those clearly enough where they have a very good concept. I can't tell you how many times you'll get a grant and the grant is really based on one publication, and I will, as a reviewer, go read that publication as part of understanding the grant. And so I will usually do that. But if it's a culmination of a body of work that you've been doing for a while, some of that data, even though it's published, might need to be in the grant, really to set the stage, to set the foundation. This is a little section that I wrote in one of my most recent grants where the grant was really based on one main publication, this reference 16 here. And so I basically summarized what that paper said, and I pointed to all the figures in the paper that I thought were relevant for the grant. And so, if they were going to go review the paper, I told them exactly where to look, what figures to look at, and what those figures showed, so they can double check me, but also have a very complete understanding of what we published and how that formed the grant that I'm writing now. Rachel alluded to this as well. Do not ignore expected results and pitfalls. You've got to convince the reviewer that you've got things covered, especially if your hypothesis ends up being wrong, or if you get unexpected results. You have to have plan Bs. You have to have things that you can change at really, at a moment's notice if things really, go in the wrong direction. I'm a big believer in writing future directions. I usually do one big one at the end of aim 1, at the end of aim 2, whatever. And they're pretty in-depth and they're pretty large, almost to the level of another aim. And I do this because I think it gives the reviewer, some perspective as, to the effort you put into thinking about your project and thinking about your grant. So you've put in the extra time to evaluate all these outcomes. You have a plan in place if what you propose doesn't work, and even if it does work, you've actually given the reviewer evidence that you're thinking about your project even beyond the 4 or 5 years you're getting funded to do it. You're thinking about where else this can go. So I think it's very critical to include this as a component, of the approach. And then regarding the revisions, I think Rachel did a good job talking about the introduction. But I think at the end of the day, one thing you really want to do, you want to be very humble and thankful for the reviewer's time and effort. But you don't want to be too self-deprecating. You don't want to come off as, oh God, why did I think of that? Thank you for giving me that wonderful comment. It's okay to, just, butter them up, if you will, and everything. But, you're the expert, right? This is your project. This is your data, right? And so, you're going to sell that. And so, defend it, stand up for it, not in an egotistical way, in a proud way. So I think that's important to do as well. The last little thing I want to talk on is rigor. And part of this is because I give a reproducibly and rigor talk, every year here as part of our responsible conduct of research. And so scientific rigor is the application of the scientific method to ensure robust and unbiased experimental design, methodology, analysis, interpretation, and reporting of results. And this is something that we really talk about a lot in study sections, that we really talk about how rigorous is something tested, how rigorous is the approach, how rigorous are the aims, And so, I have a couple of examples of what I've done. This is, just to sprinkle in a little bit of data here. We're just measuring the cytokine in the lung here. This is a mouse that's deficient in IL-15. This is a mouse that's deficient in the chemokine receptor. So how do we verify this? How do we prove or support these findings? Well, you go use agonists or antagonists or inhibitors to do that. So here we have a knockout mouse of the IL-15 receptor. And so here we treated mice with a soluble version of that, normal mice, same phenotype. Same thing with here, we have a knockout mouse, we treat it with an antagonist, we get the same phenotype. And so again, this is verifying your findings using complementary methods. We like to see this as reviewers. We like to see high rigor in the experimental designs. This is one of my most recent R1s, and this is actually a section out of my innovation section, which I actually really enjoy writing. I think it's a great place to really sell your ideas and your data and really highlight the gaps in knowledge. And in this particular grant, we have a knockout mouse, we have an overexpression mouse, and we have a reporter mouse. We have certain reagents where I work on fungi, and so we have a parental strain, we've got a fungal strain that is mutated in a specific area, and then we have a purified reagent from that fungi. So again, all about rigor. Here's another example. Have a knockout mouse, you block something in vivo, and then you overexpress it in vivo. Target specific reagents. We saw some of this earlier where we're doing Cre-Lox and cell specific knockouts, things like that. So I think rigor is something that you always want to be vigilant of. And what Rachel was showing, it's okay to be over ambitious if you're being rigorous. I think that's a good thing. If you're answering the question 3 ways that are complementary, I'm never going to fault you for that. So I think that's my last slide. And so if we want to open it up to questions, I think Rachel and I would be happy to take any questions.